So everyone, welcome to the inaugural talk of our Knowledge Standards Foundation seminar called The Technology of Decentralization. And so what I want to do, how I want to start here is sort of explain just a little bit about the course. But even before that, I'd like to introduce my two guests here. So we have Peter Magnuson, who is a Silicon Valley executive, or he was, now more of a Silicon Valley apostate, and with deep experience in many aspects of the internet. He was a top, well-paid executive with insight into the inner workings of companies like Google and Oracle and others. So, and we also have Jean-Francois Groff, one of the founders of, you don't get to say this very often, one of the founders of the World Wide Web, who actually worked with that other guy, Tim Berners-Lee, yeah. And in defining things like HTML, HTTP, and the URL format. This is going to be exciting, I think. But before we begin the conversation, let me just give a very brief sort of overview of what I see this seminar doing. This video series, to begin with, is just going to help orient the community to think about the topic for the week. The weeks that we, in which we are exploring the overall topic of the technology of decentralization, they actually will have two different purposes. One is to basically educate people about how and why one might want a more decentralized internet, how to go about constructing out what tools we should choose, and all kinds of issues there. But then there's the more specific practical questions, and that could be quite theoretical. Then there's the more specific practical questions of what policies the Knowledge Standards Foundation should adopt in building a decentralized encyclopedia network, and at the same time, a decentralized social media network. I don't really see us as building the latter, but more as participating in an interesting way with an RSS reader that uses RSS, or the blogging system, basically, to exchange social media messages. So that's the general topic, and this is a huge topic, right? It has toes in every aspect of the internet. So we're gonna focus it in various different ways. And our focus this week, to kick things off, is to find out what exactly is wrong with the internet, basically, such that a decentralized network like the encyclosphere, and I'll explain what that is at some point, that decentralized networks present a solution to the problems with the internet. And so let's get to the conversation. I'm very excited about this. I've interviewed, or rather I've introduced my guests here, and I think I propose, unless you guys want to say something about yourselves before we begin. What do you reckon?
Let's get into it, Larry.
Okay, all right, we're going to get right into it then. So the first question is, what's wrong with the internet today? So I don't want you to just use this to kvetch. I'd like you to just explain what you think are the root or most significant problems with the internet, and how we can how we should best describe what has gone wrong, essentially. And why don't we begin with you, Jean?
It's a very interesting question, what's wrong with the internet? But you might as well ask what's wrong with the world. The internet is a very large part of the world today, and I'm not going to be the person telling you all that's wrong with the world or all that's good with the world. Similarly, I'm not going to say all that's wrong with the internet in my opinion, which is probably a good thing in the opinion of other people. But I can give you a few anecdotes of problems that have arisen in the internet or in the web and that have been solved, and other problems that unfortunately either have emerged recently or were here forever but have never been solved. So for example, because the optimistic person in me always goes first, I'm a telecom engineer by training, and I've witnessed several generations of communication technologies. When I was coming of age, the GSM had just been invented. It's in part a French invention, by the way. We had the Minitel in France, which was the first widely...
The other part being Scandinavian, so I think we covered it between our ethnic backgrounds there. We gave you guys the GSM.
Ericsson and France.
Ericsson,
yes.
Nokia, and France Telecom. You're welcome, by the way, world. Okay.
So we had in France, we were very lucky when I was a teen that we had the Minitel, which was the first mass market, massive information system, which was used for everything from booking your train tickets to filing your taxes and dating, reading the press, obviously, anything you can think of, even porn on a 40 columns by 25 line bitmap screen, you had porn. So everything could be done.
Right.
So I witnessed these technologies come and go, and I witnessed, the balance, the balancing swing between, oh, let's do all centralized computing. No, let's do decentralized computing with the PC. And then, no, let's do centralized computing with client server. And then let's do decentralized computing with the cloud. So, which is in fact centralized in a way. So I'm not very, partisan of either centralization or decentralization. The question is how you use those tools in order not to impede on people's freedoms and in order to maximize the global welfare of all users of these technologies. So one thing that I really loved about the way the internet has evolved since the 90s is that it didn't crash. That's impressive in and of itself. There were plenty of professionals of networking in the 90s who said, oh, careful with this World Wide Web thing, you click here and you get an image from the other side of the world. If everybody does that, of course, the network is going to collapse. And one guy even promised to eat his own hat if the internet did not collapse by a certain date. Of course, the internet did not collapse, and it did hat or the article he had written, I don't know. But it was very serious people saying that. It was not just random doomsayers. So we had to take this seriously. And there was a combination of technology evolution, strong consumer demand, which meant you could have a lot of investment into fiber and telecom links and equipment and modems and economies of scale, whatever you want, that let the internet grow faster even in terms of data capacity than what was needed. so that today in every let's say rich country household, you have a multi megabit or even gigabit connection where every person in the family can watch a movie separately on a different screen, and it's fine. And it costs like $50 a month on average, 30 in some countries, 80 in some others. So that's absolutely impressive. Now, what do we do with all that power? We don't do much more. It's like when you say, oh, my computer today runs Microsoft Word just as fast or just as slowly as my computer of the 80s ran Microsoft Word. You're just doing the same thing. But your computer from the 80s for sure couldn't do that Zoom call with us. So I'm really grateful for all the engineering and all the investment and all the usage patterns that went into making the internet a really, really accessible tool.
So, well, let me interrupt you here.
I really like to is that today we have more than 4.5 billion people connected some way to the internet.
So, I mean, we entirely agree with you that the internet is a great thing. I think I speak for probably everyone watching this, that the internet has many great things about it. But and I totally agree that my question is loaded, and I perhaps shouldn't have said that there's something implied that there's something just terribly wrong with the internet. I think there is, but you don't necessarily have to agree. But there certainly are certain things that are wrong with the internet today that were not problems 20 years ago. Yeah, and which are related, as I said, to the centralization of the internet. And so that's the sort of theme that I wanted to explore a little bit. I could actually put it this way: do you actually think that it is a problem that, in any way, that the internet has become centralized?
It's not centralized technically. Thank God, there is still one single internet and a suite of protocols you can connect to. That's what a lot of people have fought for. But in fact, the applications, the usage of the internet has become compartmentalized, let's say, between various very strong platforms. And in each category of usage of the internet, over 20 years, leaders have emerged, and it tends to be a winner take all, or let's say winner takes 95%, and then number two takes maybe 4%, and then the rest of 1% is for the next 10 players. So that happens to be a natural tendency of the economy and even of life in general. But on the internet, this natural tendency is accelerated by technology. So it's both good and bad, because some big guys control you, and we complain every day about Facebook or Google or Twitter and how they can decide what you can say or not say, right? And what you can see, even it's a search. But also, most of these companies didn't exist 15 years ago, and we've seen repeatedly how even very powerful corporations running very popular services on the internet can be displaced overnight by new competitors. So it's not all that bad.
Okay.
I'm the positive spinner here, so maybe let's hear what Peter has to say.
Sure,
so I think Jean is addressing it initially mostly from a technical perspective, and an old mentor of mine advised me when I was interacting with large corporations that you need to know whether a problem, an obstacle that you're dealing with is of political nature or of an engineering nature. And you can't fix an engineering problem with a political argument, and you can't fix a political problem with an engineering argument. It's an amazing, the technical achievement is amazing. I've always been on the sort of lane alongside the internet. So as you know, the internet came partly out of itself as a new thing, but also very much coming out of the telecom industry and the networking around there. So I had a career in academia where I was working with the networking side, the computer architecture side, the software development of the operating systems, all to feed the beast that John alluded to, which was people saying, "Oh, this is going to crash. This can't possibly scale." I was on the side of the equation of academics and engineers saying, well, no, there's nothing fundamental about this that's going to break. It's just going to be a lot of hard work. And there's a lot of things that need to be developed. And the internet as a technical achievement has demonstrated how we've run into all the, the fact that we've been able to stretch IPv4 to the point that it is now just, you'd ask John or me or anybody else, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, said, "Hey, you got to transition to something else." And now it's really locked in. It's because of the way reputation has become a commodity. It's certainly never going to transition to IPv6. But I think what's
interesting right there, you said a technical constraint, IPv4, limited address space, turns into a societal constraint, like how is your reputation managed, depending on which IP address you
right. So and you can't solve the reputation problem technically because it turns into that you can't manage a database of 64-bit addresses to track reputation of IP addresses. Sorry, Larry, we went into a real geeky subset that John and me and 0.2% of the audience is going to understand. But well, yes, but the solution is hard to find from a technical point. So what the problem? I mean, so let me push back on something. So
sure.
So no, we don't have one internet, right? Any more than we say that we have one world and pretend that there isn't such a thing as borders or gates or anything. Yeah, we have one surface of the planet, but there are controls everywhere. So we don't have one internet in that sense. If depending on what country you are in, depending on how you're getting online, then you're actually seeing something different. And there is no human right for anybody to connect their computer to anybody else's computer. So that I think was part of the original academic, Unix-derived internet vision that the web carried over, which was I should be able to connect to a web server on anybody's computer, right? So that's manifestly not the case. There's plenty of, pretty big percentage of the population of the world will have their local government knocking on their door if they actually do that. It also, the access to the internet had been initially envisioned as being, the Unix-based IP address plus port, and I'm running something there. De facto, that doesn't happen because of the problem of discovery. So how do I find the local server of a local restaurant? The directory is controlled by the companies that then monetize access, right? So it used to be, so the telephone companies had contractual mandates from the government that they have to put out a directory listing of everybody's phone number and address. But they skipped all that with the internet. So nobody is compelled to tell me how to find the server of the local restaurant. Instead, various semi-monopolies have made it that they have to be on Google Maps, they have to be on Apple Maps, they have to be on Yelp or some combination of that. And the moment they do that, they're giving up a lot of their control and the information about all their customers and so forth. So there's this vision that was of freedom of connecting that in practice doesn't happen. And there's no limits to price gouging, for example, in this area. So if you're a mom and pop shop, and you want to advertise that, you know, I sell shoes in Reno, if you want to win those advertising words on a search engine, you're competing with all the other mom and pop shows, and you're just arbitrarily giving up your margin to some big company somewhere else. So you have all these elements that are happening.
Problem, yeah.
So you know, part of it becomes a conversation about what do we mean by centralization of what is it that we mean by the internet. And if we look at it, if we look at the fundamentals of human communication, if we look at it from just you can go through the United Nations Human Rights Charter or the American Bill of Rights and see who actually is an arbiter now of these things, right? Do I have a right? Do I have a right of pursuit of happiness? Well, there's a lot of control over who I'm allowed to talk to, how I'm allowed to interact with them, how I can send funds with them or not. In practice, how am I able to start a business or reach out to business? You've got you can't have a local community organization with a local website with a local discussion forum, because things like Nextdoor take over everything, because they got all the marketing money, and then they centralize all that information, and then they resell it to God knows who. So you've literally got the centralization of what was unimaginable amount of centralization of human activities, right? I mean, you know, it's.
Well, I said earlier, in every category of use for the internet, there emerged one or two leaders, and maybe they are by territory.
And they never get replaced. So,
if you're not
so point to me a single player that's been replaced in the last 20 years.
What? Oh, plenty. I mean, Facebook displaced Myspace. Hello.
And Friendster, sure.
And Friendster and others, countless others. High Five, I remember.
No, that was not a big player replacing another big player. MySpace was tiny.
Oh. Reddit.
Even at their peak. So, I mean, so you know, you have to think in terms of what percentage, you know, what percentage was a player big, right? So displacing is when you're taking over somebody else's market, right? Myspace didn't start losing users until Facebook had already overtaken them.
Oh, it was big, but the whole space of social networks expanded so fast, and Myspace, by not growing.
Yes, but that's a very big difference, right? So overtaking is very different from displacing.
Well, I'll give you an example. Snapchat was displaced by TikTok. It was. Okay, so thank you both for that. I'd like to
rebound before you move on. I'd like to rebound on something Peter mentioned, with which I in fact can relate. The idea that it's very, very hard to get your service discovered. I mean, you can technically access the internet and publish your thing or advertise well, make your services available, whatever they are. Let's say I'm a local chiropractor. I can have a little website where I say, hey, I'm a chiropractor, come and book me. But if Google doesn't index you, if you don't buy the AdWords, if you don't have good reviews, you're screwed. So I agree with that. In the, let's say, early.
But somebody else controls the definition of what is a good review.
Correct.
Or what even is a review, right?
Yeah, and trolls can destroy your business for no apparent reason, and the internet never forgets, blah, blah, blah. So that's bad. In the early days of the World Wide Web expansion, when we were, giddy, when the web reached, let's say, 1% of the global internet traffic, that was 1993. It was 2 years after we launched the system. 2 years is a long time, but we reached 1%. We thought this thing is maybe going to be big. And the idea was, in a few years, first companies, smaller and smaller companies, not just the big ones, but then individuals will have 24-hour access to the internet through some technology, be it DSL or whatever it may be. And through that, everybody will run their own server. We designed the protocols in a way that any computer could be a web server, and it didn't require lots of resources to start it up. We designed the protocols maybe a bit naively, but clearly we wanted to make them as lean as possible so they don't consume resources. So the idea was, oh, in a few years, once you don't dial into the internet with a modem, but you have a fixed line, then of course, everybody will run their own server. And there will be a smorgasbord of tools to help mere mortals run their servers. That didn't happen. So essentially, in the early days of the web, when this thing started to grow, the idea among the pioneers was, well, soon enough, everybody will have a 24/7 connection to the internet, thanks to DSL and perhaps one day mobile. And obviously, everybody will run their own web server, but that didn't happen. Even when we had very fast connections where any, moderate size web presence could be served from a home, you had only a few geeks who did that. All the rest of the world, even those who wanted to publish stuff, they were very happy sending their stuff to a web hosting company, which provided online tools to edit stuff and publish, and then RSS arrived, but that didn't bring things back to the home computer. It was always on servers. And you'd be hard pressed today to find even one geek who runs his own web server from his home. I mean, I think crypto miners.
Mine's right here. I'm touching it. I'm touching
it.
it.
Okay, you're one of the dinosaurs then. Okay. I gave up on that 12 years ago already. I gave up managing my own email when Gmail came around. So that's where we lost a lot of the potential power of decentralization. I mean, if everybody had control of their own data on their own machine with appropriate tools to configure it and manage it easily, we wouldn't have a situation where Facebook or Twitter can control what you say and where Google or others can control what gets indexed.
Yes.
So I don't know if we can ever get back to that utopia, but I'm forced to say that this utopia never happened. It was expected, but it didn't happen.
I think there was a time, I remember.
And it wasn't the fault really of the fundamental technology, because it was all set for it.
Listen, I remember a time for basically from the time that I got involved, my first Usenet news group and started my first mailing list and my very first GeoCities site back in like 1990, but this was between 1994 and 1996. You really could, say almost anything you wanted, and the way that other people could shut you down is by putting you in their kill file. As it was called. So what we used in lieu of censorship was individual one-on-one silencing of particular other voices, which is something we still do, like on Twitter. I can block people who I find annoying.
Yeah, but that's very different. It means you can choose the people you don't want to hear from. Yeah. That's one thing. But what we have today is somebody who is neither elected nor in your control chooses who you can read or not.
Yeah.
Or whether even you yourself can publish something.
Let me move us along a little bit. I actually want to riff a little bit on what you were saying, and by way of offering my own answer to this question of what's wrong with the internet today. So Jean, you offered a pretty high-level technical celebration of the internet, almost, in terms of what it's achieved, and again, I think that's perfectly valid and a good point. And Peter then pointed to the structural difficulties that are involved with that have enabled giant corporations to essentially concentrate their power. I want to talk a little bit about the implications in terms of what I call our digital rights. I actually think that there are digital components to our civil or individual rights. The right to free speech has a digital analog. The right to privacy has a digital analog. The right to autonomy, which is, I would call something like the analog to freedom of movement or something like that, or the ability to conduct yourself as long as you're following the law, more or less however you want, and not be guided around by the nose by anyone. These are really important rights. And the thing that has motivated me to start the Knowledge Standards Foundation, frankly, is profound disappointment at the way in which our rights to free speech and privacy and autonomy have been systematically violated by giant corporations. This is not to say that we can't, as you say, start up our own servers and go to what would really be superhuman lengths in order to exercise those rights in a way that compares with what is afforded by like Facebook and Twitter and the rest. One can do that, but the average person certainly can't. The average person is dependent upon some sort of service provider, and you cannot actually interact freely with everyone who is online today in the same way that you could before. And you don't have nearly the guarantees of safety and privacy that we had 20 years ago. That's the problem that I see with the internet today. And I think that it can be laid at the doorstep of centralization, that ultimately the fact that these giant corporations have basically seized control of who we can talk to a certain extent, what we are enabled to say, even if we haven't been kicked out, and so forth.
Yeah, but they control the visibility of what you say. The massive problem, and maybe some of the lay audience doesn't realize that yet, is that all human conversation in public forums, okay, I'm not talking of private, calls, which are still, feasible without too much hindrance, but all public communication today is curated by AI, is curated by algorithms, which even their writers don't know anymore how they function because it's just too massive. Who can moderate thousands of hours of video content uploaded every second to YouTube? This is, as you said, Larry, a superhuman task. And these giant corporations, I think they not so much wanted to control, but they had to control what's going on because otherwise it was unmanageable.
Interesting. Well, let's get back to that if we have time. I'd like to move on to the next question, which is to get back. So the first question is, what's wrong with the internet today? Now I want to take us back to closer to the beginning of the history of the internet and talk about the original killer app of the internet, the web. Basically, and I think a good place to begin here.
Yeah, we almost killed it. It's true.
Yeah. So the question is, what problems did HTTP and HTML and the URL solve? This is, I just want to sort of get toward like a definition of the World Wide Web by explaining what each of the protocols solved. So if you could sort of explain it at an undergraduate, like introductory, undergraduate level, I think that'd be a
Sure.
good place
Oh,
to begin.
I'll do 12-year-old level, no problem.
Sure.
So, as you correctly said, the World Wide Web is a layer of knowledge, of information, more rightly put, which is using the internet as a communication medium. So the internet, in layman's term, is the plumbing, and the World Wide Web is the water running through the plumbing, right? So when you want to move some data, some information from a place to another, the first thing you need is to define what place. So one place is pretty well defined because that's the computer I'm sitting in front of, or my laptop, my phone. That's point A. But where's point B? Where's the place where I can get that information? So the way we embodied this notion of defining a place on the internet is called the URL, which originally was called the UDI, Universal Document Identifier. For some obscure reasons, which we can go through another time, it became Uniform Resource Locator, which nobody understands. So think of it as a universal document identifier. It identifies a document. So it tells you where, well, identify would be what it is. So that's why they say it's a locator, but it locates a document. So it tells you where you can find this document. And how does it tell you that?
Address.
It's an address, but it tells you that in a universal way. That means everybody should understand, should be able to access this place if we only tell them this is the URL. And we made the URL very short, very naive, and layered on top of the DNS system. DNS is the thing that says wikipedia.org is a name that points to IP address 128.141. something.
You say very short, but I've always had a complaint with, like, why the hell do I have to type in http:// every time?
I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. First of all, you don't have to type it anymore because people have simplified stuff. But I'll tell you why. And that's part of the universal characteristic of the URLs. Imagine a world where you don't have the web, but you do have the internet, and you have plenty of applications running on top of the internet, shuffling data here and there. FTP, file transfer protocol, you can access a file which is stored elsewhere. Telnet, you can access a computer which is running elsewhere. You can.
Oh, I have a question for you, Jean. How many different protocols like HTTP does the typical browser support today?
Today, I don't know, but in the early days, we supported a new protocol every week. Every time somebody came up with a new system, we had Archie, Prospero, Waze, Gopher, what have you.
Yeah.
And as soon as the protocol came to our knowledge, we looked at how it worked, we implemented it, and suddenly every browser in the world could access data stored around this protocol. And that's why the web gradually subsumed all the pre-existing distributed information system. That's why even very powerful corporations such as Microsoft, AOL, Apple, CompuServe, you name it, had to abandon their proprietary networks and moved their audience to the World Wide Web because it was truly universal and simpler, and people who could click from any place to another place didn't want to launch a new program to suddenly access data that was in, let's say, the CompuServe world. They said, why can't I, just click like I click for my email? So that's why we encompass things.
A web browser like Chrome, for example, is a web browser. So it deals pretty much exclusively, but not exclusively, with HTTP or HTTPS.
Oh no, I'm sure it still supports.
I think it supports a FTP for sure. I don't know about others, but to the extent that it supports those others like FTP, it's not just a web browser; it's also an internet browser, right?
Yeah, well, that's how we define the web. The web is not just HTTP. The web,
it's not.
Fundamentally, is every data you can access through a URL. That's the web. Now, some of these data can be accessed through the HTTP protocol, some through the, let's say, RTSP protocol. That's real-time streaming. That's probably what we're doing right now through Zoom. We're using RTSP to stream video to each other. It's still the web. So that was the genius, and that credits to Tim, who had this brilliant idea that we won't do just a file system thing like we had FTP, we had ways to address files, but he said no, we should address anything, email, news, phone conversation, whatever it was. So that's the URL, and then the other standards to me are secondary, still very necessary. So the HTTP is the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, which funnily has nothing to do with hypertext. Hypertext is a thing that's in HTML. So you have some text and you can define a zone of text which you can click and then leads to somewhere else. The transfer protocol is just a way to fetch a file. So once you know, if I come back to what I explained, you define this web, this universe of information, where every piece, every document, every video stream, every address in the world is defined by a URL. And then when you want to fetch something from this place, you do it through the HTTP. So HTTP, your computer talks HTTP to the computer that has the information. And that computer on the other side says, hey, I have information in that format. Can you read that? And then you say, yes, sure, send me the PDF. And you get the PDF and your browser displays it. It's that simple. So then the display format, we used a very, very crude markup language called HTML, which was derived from IBM's SGML, which is much more complex. So we pared it down to the strict essentials. We said, okay, there should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 levels of headers, paragraphs, lists. That's about it. Signatures, italics. That's all we had. HTML 0.9, 1.0 was extremely simple. And HTML has evolved. It's now at HTML5. It's an extremely complicated thing that can do all kinds of magic stuff, even video through the web. Layout. It's really fantastic what has been done on HTML, but we didn't see at all HTML as becoming the mainstream document description language. There were already back in the day much more advanced description languages such as LaTeX, MathML, specialized things, music notation, but everything got imported into HTML. I guess it's the same thing I described with the other protocols that got imported under the web, under the URL, the browser. The same thing happened with HTML. So now it's all blurred. People don't really know what it is. So that's how it grew. That's why it was necessary, because if you want to browse information, if you want to navigate through information, you need a way to say where is the information, a way to go fetch it, and then once you have fetched it, a way to display it. So these are the URL, the HTTP, the HTML at the 12-year-old level.
So the reason that I wanted to ask that question was to set us up for the follow-up question, which is, I'm keeping track of time here. Was it essential to the early development of the web and other internet tools that they were open source and non-proprietary? So why, for example,
would you mind if I jumped in and just added to what John was asking, was answering there about what it is? I mean, I would say that what John is describing is the first phase of the internet, but then what happened was Netscape came along, and said and made the descriptor, which was thought of being a static structural object, dynamic. With if you do web programming, it's called the DOM object, and then adding a scripting language to it, which wasn't originally called JavaScript, has nothing to do with Java at all. Yeah, well, no, that's a standardization thing later. The original one was called NetScript, or there was an internal project name. Because correct me if I'm wrong, but the scripting didn't come out of the standardization work at all. That was
came out of the Netscape. You're right.
Right. No, it was a hack basically.
We were very worried. We didn't want to put a Turing complete language in the pages.
Right.
We didn't want that.
No, yes,
Adobe
exactly.
had done that with PDF.
Yes.
They had their own problems. We said, let's not
Yes,
go down this path.
So this is what
But
I
they
wanted
did
to
it
get
anyway.
to. This is what I wanted to get to, because if you were an academic designer, computer architect, understanding these things, you don't put a Turing complete scripting language inside the thing, because at that point it explodes. And again, we're getting really technical. But I think to understand what happened with the internet, there are some of these what we might label like technology choke point and sort of decision paths that then took it in a completely different direction. So there was two phases to that. First was the realization that Netscape did a lot of jumped on this and basically started the process of making the HTTP, HTML world into an operating system, a complete standalone operating system.
Totally.
And today it is effectively, if you go and look at the modern web API, it's like, oh, this is more than Unix. This is bigger than Unix System 5 API programming interface. So what happens then, that was the first step. But even then, the assumption was that, yeah, but you can't really do anything heavyweight there because it's an interpreted, scripted, constrained language.
Oh my God.
Then came right. Then came some language people
optimized the hell out of it.
Right. Well, and then said, well, if we can do runtime translation, we can do runtime code generation, and then you basically ended up merging the idea that was Java, even though, I mean, there's a conceptual connection between them, but not like a direct technical. But the idea that is Java, which is, can we do a portable, simple language that targets a so-called language virtual machine and make it work on all devices? And then that idea, Java was was adopted a lot, but it was also very influential conceptually. So then, right. So then some crazy guys, Lars Bach's team in Denmark, it's always Scandinavians doing language stuff, says, hey, let's combine these things, put a couple of constraints on the JavaScript, and we can do that with like language standardization and pre-processing. And then we can do actually some hardcore computer language optimization and so forth, which then opened up the whole...
today. Guess what?
Yes, exactly. And then Microsoft finally adopts that engine, right? So the loop is complete. So that means that we transitioned to a browser becoming your main delivery vehicle of an application.
Instead of just data. Yeah, that's correct.
Right. And
it's like the genome, the genome, we thought it was just data, but we realized it's as much program as data.
Right. So I mean, so the most, if you look statistically, the most common HTTP request on the planet is basically using it as a Unix pipe, and you just want data, and you're going to pack, to being processed, And if you look at the definition of the web API at Mozilla Developer Network for the fetch call, it's, oh, this is a Unix read.
It's RPC. Yeah.
It's a Unix read. Yeah, it's a Unix read, right? It's open a socket and let me read from it. And at that point, everything changes, because now you're not browsing from documents between computers. You are accessing a application that's controlled by the servers. Now it's a step back in freedom. It used to be I would install a program on my workstation or my personal computer, and that program I would control. Now I've given up even more control. I don't even know what code is coming in there. It's dynamically. They can inject code on a per IP moon phase. What I'm clicking on, they can put in different code. They
can have a dozen
read
of subframes contacting advertising networks.
Yes,
you never hear about them.
They can capture biometrics on whether or not my mouse is shaking or not, and then they can resell that data.
Yes, did you know that?
Yeah, no, this is like, so that changed the whole thing. So there's one important thing to state is that you can't blame the internet architects for this, because they literally try to stop it. No, I mean, it literally tried to stop it, right? Standardization, no, we're not going to have scripting language. And then it became this whole
scripting language didn't care, it ran over.
Right. So because if you're just looking at a static document, then you are in control. So now we went into a direction where the end user of all of this is just losing more and more and more control. And the same thing with people coming online. They're also losing more and more control. So suddenly you got this crazy thing that your telephone directory wants to know where you are and on what floor you are before I'm going to tell you which business I'm going to show you. And that is ultimately what has led up to all the things that when Larry, you say, what's the problem with the internet? Right. I guess the short answer is because the internet stopped being the internet.
And what you said is it relates to why ordinary people don't run their websites, because it has become not just a website serving documents, which a blog was arguably, but today it's more than that. You're right. It's apps. It's complex stuff.
Yes, yes. So look, you've gotten ahead of where I wanted, and this is actually a very interesting exchange, but I'd like to go back and look at one of the features of the early internet and explore how it changed, namely the fact that the very early web was open source. It was non-proprietary. You told me and a few of us, I think it was a couple of months ago, Jean, that it was actually very important that things like HTTP and HTML were open source and non-proprietary, and that they simply wouldn't have spread if that weren't the case.
Correct.
So can you explain a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, again, I mean, Peter might say we're going back to the prehistory of the web when I'm saying that. So, okay,
when responsible adults were in charge.
Yeah. Well, what I'm gonna say is valid like until 1999, and then you party like it's 2000. Yeah. So the web, like a lot of internet-based developments, drew a lot culturally from the open source movement, which was in full swing. When we released the first public version of the World Wide Web in August '91, that's exactly the same month that Linus Torvalds released version 0.1 of Linux. And obviously, all of the World Wide Web had been programmed using the GNU suite of tools by Richard Stallman and friends, because every programmer worth his salt, his or her salt, as soon as they got a new machine from, let's say, Sun, IBM, Digital Equipment, Cray even, they ripped out all the built-in compilers by IBM and friends, and they installed GNU instead, GNU compiler, because it was so much better. Not that it was better every time or that it was more optimized, but when you had a problem with GNU, meaning open source code, you could go ahead and fix it because you're an engineer. So that's really the miracle. So we didn't have to wait until IBM is going to fix the bug maybe 3 months from now, if enough users complain about it. But we can fix it ourselves and then contribute back. So that was the spirit in which most programmers I know of in the 90s, especially in the C culture and the networking culture, operated. So it was totally natural for us that everything we wrote should be open source. The world was not open source, by the way. Back in the day, it was either public domain, which is a bit different, or it was free software. Free software was a big thing, popularized by, again, Richard Stallman. So it was natural for us to make the software free, and then that extended in our minds, and especially in Tim's view, that also the documents should be free. So not only the software that lets us publish documents should be free, but also the documents themselves that we do publish should be freely accessible as much as possible. And the web indeed attracted a lot of early creators of sites who picked siloed data, which was available in closed databases, and then they made them visible to the whole world through the World Wide Web. And that was the purpose. And they didn't care too much about copyright. I remember one guy who had basically violated the whole copyright of the Louvre collection, and he did a much more beautiful Louvre exhibit on the web than the real one by the real Louvre. So he was very popular. After a while, the Louvre caught up with him and told him to stop. But because most of these works of art were out of copyright by definition, they couldn't tell him to stop that much. He stopped using the name Louvre, but the museum was still there. So we attracted a lot of people who publish data freely, but not all data is free and not all programs are free. We know that. One reason I mentioned that it was very important to make the web fundamental technologies free of use for everybody is that it was not a given that the web would dominate. There were plenty of competing protocols and competing tools. At one point, Gopher was 15 times more popular than the web.
I remember using that actually a lot.
Yes, you do.
In the early 1990s.
Yeah. It's because it was good. And there was not much difference in the transmission protocol implemented by Gopher and the one implemented by the web. Gopher could only serve files in a file structure, but they would have extended it to do search and to do advanced stuff, I'm sure. But what happened is someday at CERN, we saw people in suits coming to visit from either Adobe, Digital Equipment, IBM, these kinds of corporations, who had a stake in the tools that will be used for the information age. And they came to us and to Tim, and Robert Caillot was very involved in the politics of it all, and said, look, okay, CERN has a very open policy, all your software is free to use, but it's still copyright CERN. And that may be bad in the long term, because CERN might one day assert, our software, you cannot use it for that kind of application because we don't like it. Let's say we are physicists, we don't like that you're going to use it for politics. With the reverse of today, right? The people in politics say you can't talk about chemistry or medicine if you're not doing the right politics. Anyway, so there was this fear that maybe the originating institution, if it kept the copyright, would have too much control on the evolution of these standards. And therefore, after a lot of debate with a lot of the industry participants, the core team of the World Wide Web and the volunteers all over the world who were contributing decided to push the CERN management for them to make it not only free software, but public domain software. Public domain means you give up your copyright, like it belongs to nobody and belongs to everybody. So that was a foundational move legally that happened also in 93, I believe it was April 93, when CERN management officially signed off, yes, this is public domain, do whatever you want. That was good. Yeah.
Right, so I was about to explain why I asked about this background about the early development of the web and why it was chosen to be, well, public domain actually, and that actually is essential to its popularization. Sorry about that. So what I wanted to ask was, is it fair to say that open standards, that the openness and the freedom of HTTP, HTML, and so forth, that is what helped the internet to be decentralized? In other words, that the fact that anyone could use HTML, anyone could set up their own server and so forth, was essential to the spread of websites in general.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. No, it was absolutely essential that it's decentralized, and there was this kind of Cambrian explosion of information and of opinions and ways to present stuff. And remember, GeoCities, this kind of stuff, which today we laugh at, but it was laudable as a way for people to express themselves directly. The big revolution of the web compared to other media, the web is a new media. Okay? So because it's a new media, before the web you had television, before television you had radio, before radio you had cinema, and before cinema you had the printed press. So all of these media forms were subjected to one form or another of censorship and were able to be used as tools of free expression in various circumstances over history and in various periods. So I'm not surprised that the same debates come back to the web because it's just another new media. So we didn't see it politically that way, but we did see that the web, contrary to the previous media, was a great equalizer, that anybody with almost zero resources, okay, you need an internet connection. In the beginning, it was not given to everybody, but it was still really relatively easy to come by. And any computer could be a web server, and you could publish your stuff and people could read it. You didn't have to worry about traffic, because by the time there were 100 million people on the internet, you also had machines that were 100 times more powerful. So there was not so much a problem of traffic. And when you publish your stuff, if you're not very popular, you're gonna have maybe 100 people reading your page and you're super happy about it. Mm-hmm. So, people have these stat counters, like how many visitors did I have? It's totally gone out of fashion, but people were really happy about that. Sure. So it was a great equalizer in terms of access to the publishing side of media. Whereas my generation was essentially a consumer of media. We had no way to publish without being, a vetted author that has a column in a newspaper, or somebody who gets a book deal, or somebody who gets interviewed on TV. These were really rare events.
Right.
People were competing to go on TV, on TV games, not for the prize of the game, but for the boast factor of saying, hey, I've been on TV. Whereas today, everybody goes on YouTube, and some of them become superstars, and some of them become obscure, but still they can say, I have my channel, I'm doing my thing. Mm-hmm. So that was a revolution. Sorry to harp on, because it really gets me excited, because we've lost a lot of that spontaneity. One thing that surprised us, again, with my historical insight of what the designers of the system were thinking and what the people actually did with the system. It's always interesting to compare. We thought pretty much unanimously among the designers that users, human beings, were supposed to do the interesting stuff, and the computers were supposed to do the boring stuff. So that's why we did HTTP and HTML, where you click somewhere and suddenly the 7 or 8 steps you had to do before to get access to a computer somewhere, get authorized to get there, find out where your document is, download that document, retrieve it, and then display it. So these were plenty of steps to do something. And we replaced all that with a single click. So in service of the human being, and let the machines serve the humans and not the other way around, which sometimes in front of computers, you feel like you're serving the computer. Not so much today, but back in the day, I believe you, so many times I screamed at my computer saying, I'm not serving you, you're supposed to serve me. So I think we've made progress on the user experience front. Yeah. So one thing we didn't expect, because we had this mindset that people should use tools very easily, we had the mindset that the URLs, the HTML language should be invisible to the users. The users should be able to edit a document like they do a Word document. They don't look at the inside markup language behind Word. They did that in very, very early versions of word processing systems where you had markup. Mm-hmm. But that went away. There was the WYSIWYG revolution in the 80s, and people edit the document directly. So that's how the web worked originally. It was the first prototype of the web. If you look it up, it's called World Wide Web. It ran on the Next machine, which was very advanced for its time. And it lets people just edit a document and save it. and as soon as it was saved, it was published online, and you could create links by selecting a bit of text saying, I want to make a link from here. And then you selected the target document among your files. That was done. You had the link. You didn't have to type angle bracket A space H ref equals blah, 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 etc. Right? So we thought it was our job as the geeks to give people the tools to use that without thinking of the technology. And what surprised us all was that people wanted to learn HTML. They wanted to type these angle brackets and to fiddle with their pages manually rather than use tools.
No.
And that was extremely surprising to all of us, especially to me.
I remember learning that myself. My first,
so you had,
your expectation was that it was going to be generated very much, right?
Yeah. No, I expect it will be mostly generated. Yeah, and the urge, it teaches me that the urge to publish, the urge to have a voice, the urge to customize what you're doing, what you're saying, and how you're saying it, and how it looks, was much stronger than the temptation to use the easy way. Yeah. And today, okay, tools have evolved, and people maybe are more tempted by the easy way. So it's easy to get on Twitter and fire a post saying, you know, I hate this guy. It's easy to do it. Maybe we lost something, you know?
Yeah.
Or maybe it's just the early enthusiasts.
Well, I mean, it's so much harder actually now to make a working competitive website than it was even 10 years ago.
As Peter said, it's an application. It's not just data.
Exactly. And an increasingly complicated application too.
Oh, yeah.
So, Larry, this is a seminar series. May I, what John described just triggered me. May I share a couple of slides here?
Peter wanted to show slides.
Share some slides, please do.
I got it. All right. So, and I'm gonna, this is directly pivoting off some of the things that John said. And I'm going to show you some slides from a presentation. I want you to guess when I gave that presentation. So what was significant? Because I was parallel, and I was trying to interpret for myself and people, what is this internet thing here? So, and I developed a model to explain it, space, time, and reach, starting with human speech 500,000 years ago, which is synchronized in time, synchronized in space. A few can reach a few. Writing is not synchronized in time, not synchronized in space. A few can reach a few. And the internet, and then I just quickly point out with telephone and radio, they're just variations of it, because between printing and the internet, all other media were compromises. So it was one of these things that you can get, the red is when you have freedom. And until the internet in human history, we had no mode of communication that did not have at least 2 out of 3 fundamental constraints. So when I did that analysis, I concluded that this is gonna impact as profound as it did in invention of printing. I actually believe that it was more profound than the invention of printing, but I was, too many people thought I was crazy just by this statement. Yeah, yes, John, but I don't think you were representative at the time. No. I was just sitting, you know, on, as part of the universe that would be enabling the growth by, okay, how the hell do we build computers that are fast enough and so forth for all this? But when I was asked to explain, well, what is this, just some, you know, famously in Sweden, the Swedish communication minister or something had said, well, maybe the internet is just a fad. But this is the thing that's new. And it occurred to me recently, in fact, it occurred to me when John was talking about it, that I think this is also a framework for understanding how this is now falling apart. So this is like a phase 1, phase 2, because we are getting control mechanisms around both space, time, and reach, right? So the fundamental vision was freedom on all these dimensions. And the constraints that have been happening are across all those dimensions. So if you guys cheated and read the footnote, you will have seen the date of it. But if you didn't cheat, can you guess when I gave that presentation?
It actually could have been almost any time, frankly. It could have been fairly early on, although, yeah, I don't know.
Well, you got to guess, or I'm not going to look good.
It's definitely the 90s.
Yeah, so Jean does, I should say Larry should guess, but yeah. No, 90, I gave that in 97, right?
97, okay. I was going to say early 2000s, but okay.
No, and that's when I put it in a keynote format. I've been kind of clear to me in 96. So and of course the tiny number of people like John understood this because this was the vision, right? Which was to unleash unleash freedom of communication.
And at the same time, Jeff Bezos thought, oh, this is going to revolutionize commerce like nothing, like the boats did. And,
yes, exactly. So I mean,
mouth was.
As obviously I was not the only one connecting these dots, but it was understood by the insiders that this was profound, but I've spent some time last year revisiting some of those visions and frameworks to understand how the constraints have been evolving. So I wanted to comment on a few other things that you were asking about in open standards and open source and so forth. So again, I think John and I are developing into this tag team. So John talks about the first 10 years and the vision, and then I come along as the sort of, oh yeah, and then this is what happened, right? So, phase 1 of industrial revolution, we invent the steam engine. Phase 2, oh, we discover we can put 9-year-olds into factories to make shoes powered by a steam engine. That's phase 2, right? So John is not responsible for the phase 2 stuff.
Phase 1, everybody starts a railway. Phase 2, they get nationalized.
well, yes, and then phase 3, they get used in World War I to make people think that they can swing armies across continents. So there's it's always wonderful to see what humanity does with these incredible inventions. But so what happened with you got this, so there's a phase 2 to the open source thing, which is that there was essentially, and that's a tie into, so a big reason why, and I think very few people really appreciate this, the dominant reason that we're not running software on a computer, but we're running it in a browser is because that uses a loophole in open source legal definition, which they've tried to close, but that surprised everybody, which was that if you are running the code on a server, it doesn't apply. It's only if you are distributing, because the assumption was it was going to continue, that if you're distributing software. So players like, famously Google, but they were following in the footsteps of others. So when Yahoo, when eBay was doing its thing, they were not that super technical. So they turned to vendors like Sun Microsystems and so forth and said, just give us a bunch of machines. And then they discovered the hard way that Sun actually didn't know how to build big enough machines. Nobody did. So part of the thing that got Google going was that they realized we're just going to hire all the computer architectures out of HP and IBM and so forth, and DEC. Again, John and I know that very few people know this, right? So Google was essentially a computer architecture startup where you said, okay, well, we're going to hire all the best people who know how to build really big computers, and we're going to build the biggest freaking computer the world has ever seen. And they eventually published a lot of this information. There was a very notable book called the data center as the computer or something like that, or and
which was realizing Sun's vision. They killed Sun by making Sun's vision a reality.
Yes. Well, and then they hired a lot of the top engineers. And then they hired a ton of the key engineers from Sun, right?
When Sun died.
So they were able to do that because they could just, there was a loophole in open source legal definitions that it only applied if you were distributing it. So if you were running it on a server and providing a service, it didn't apply. And Google and others discovered this, realized the significance of this loophole, and then they drove a Hummer through it. So they just vacuum cleaned Linux and GNU and BSD and all the public domain and open source threw into their servers, rewrote everything, and didn't have to share anything. Nothing. They didn't have to share anything. And then when they realized that they could run JavaScript in browser, a reason for driving this was that that is still not considered delivering an application. So that's still, so the pieces of code that gets pushed to the front end are perhaps open source, arguably, but certainly not the server that's sitting behind. And you can't really do one without the other. And you still see this mechanism in most open source startups. So you would have OpenVPN, will be an open source client, but not the server side, et cetera. So that became the standard model of monetizing these services. So that now broke the model fundamentally that this was going to be, they basically stole the technology and then hired all the talent that knew what to do with that technology, and then started building these platform lock-ins, right? So
the remaining talent went to Amazon and Apple.
Well, most of the internet technology, most of the internet talent is Facebook, Google, much less Amazon. And Apple not so much on the internet.
AWS, right? That's
yeah, but so that's a long conversation. Amazon is more about repackaging established technologies. Okay. They're more what AWS did was to replace Circuit City and Best Buy and a lot of the sort of mainstream shippers. Not so much that they're best in tech, right? And be downstream from the innovations. So, but that open source shift was huge, and since then the Open Source Foundation have closed the loophole with newer generations of the open source licenses. But by now it was too late, and the farm, what's it called, the barn door was open. So in both cases, so basically, if you think from a 30,000 foot. Several of the principles that the early phase people like Jean and others were trying to establish, let's not have a Turing equivalent environment in the browser. Let's have open standards. Let's have open source. They all got neutered by the big new generation of internet tech companies, like deliberately neutered. And so that, and of course, legislation and so forth was nowhere near understanding this. And by the time anybody woke up to it, they had taken over so much of media that media wasn't really an ally in any significant criticism of big tech anymore. Right. So that's like a 30,000 foot of it.
We're more into Larry's wheelhouse here, but if you talk about the view of technology by media, I was astonished how it switched totally over 20 years. Media were cheering on new technology, David versus Goliath. You're gonna, destroy the old monopolies, and that's good for the world, and it will liberate so many energies, blah, blah, blah. If you read the press release, not the press release, the press articles, like the comments about the industry by the press, by the mainstream press from 95 to 2005, it's super enthusiastic. And it's this, let's destroy to create a better world, blah, 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 blah. Yep. And today it's the total opposite. The press says, oh, only the big guys, thank God we have the big guys and the governments, and thank God everything is centralized so we can control speech, so we can control that there's no pedophiles on the internet, and there's no Trump supporters allowed to, say.
No, terrorists.
So we've actually skipped over, we've actually skipped over a question.
How this has changed? That's what you asked, Larry,
No, that's
I remember in year 2000.
But no, I'm actually comfortable with this, but I have a contribution to make myself. Basically, what we're talking about now is what enabled Silicon Valley startups to evolve into these massive giants.
Yeah.
And why? And I also asked, why didn't this happen sooner? And so Peter was talking a little bit about JavaScript. I think that had quite a bit to do with it. The fact that it was possible to build these websites that were dynamically refreshing, and that basically made it possible to run things like Google Maps, and to have updating carts on Amazon and things like that, without refreshing the page, etc. I think that was a part of it. Basically, that enabled, as you were saying, enabled a lot of the processing power to move into the browser. And by doing that, that actually gives control over the software that's it's running on your computer but in the browser, and therefore is controlled centrally by only these sufficiently skilled programmers who are able to
that's a profound remark, and thank you, Peter, for pointing that out. I never seen it that way, but it's so true. It's the same way that this thing is entirely controlled by Apple. Apple decides what I can install on it, but still I use it because, hey, it works well.
Yeah,
but because nobody else can afford to develop a custom ARM chip that goes on it, right? So it's the technology. Sorry, Larry, go ahead.
Well, it's not just that it's expensive to develop. It's gotten so complicated that that only the very best developers actually understand what the hell is going on, and how to develop systems that are competitive with the ones that are there. So
I'll tell you one more thing. It's the speed. It's not just the complexity. It's the speed. In my previous startup, I developed a payment system on mobile. It was okay. It was independent from credit cards or whatever. I don't want to pitch it because it's a dead company anyway. But developed that. It was not complicated to do it. We had some ideas. We did the right thing, and it worked. And it operated. We got a banking license, whatever. What you want. But then the speed at which the platforms evolved was maddening, and we are techies, but like every 6 months, Apple changed an API, and then Google changed an API, and then a bank changed an API, and suddenly you couldn't do what you did yesterday perfectly well, and you had to, walk around it. It's the speed. It's not just the complexity.
I've got some visual aids here.
You
got visual aids.
I've got visual aids. Okay, so right around 2005, between 2005 and 2010, we started having a desktop, a laptop, and a phone, and we had the same data on all three devices and other devices too. Several phones.
I have 4 phones here on my desk.
You're like a Nigerian, man. Yeah, they always have 3 phones in their pockets.
I remember back in 2000 or so, having a real need for transfer media, basically discs and things, and one of the main uses of these things between about 1995 and 2005 or so was to sync data across devices. But this became totally unrealistic to do once the systems became complex enough. You can't
with security walls around them.
Exactly, and therefore, basically, in order to like, for example, on my phone here, I've got a Signal app, just a randomly chosen app here. My data that my Signal app accesses, I can also. I'm not going to move my camera, but I'm pointing at the exact same icon here on my desktop, and I could find the same thing on my laptop. They all need to be naturally synced. So I'm not going to do the syncing. I mean, especially if I'm not a programmer. So that is another reason for these giant expert corporations to actually do the syncing of data for us. So, and yeah,
But
I mean,
there's
that
good in
requires,
that. There's
yeah,
good in that.
yeah,
I can see the bad because,
sure,
okay, they
sure.
got excess control, but I can see the good. As I told you earlier, I
Yes.
gave up managing email for either myself or any of the companies I worked with since when Google gave Gmail for free to everybody with
Yeah.
1 terabyte of data and then
Yep.
turned it into a productivity system for the enterprise. Wow, such a headache to stop having to deal with
Yeah.
managing an email server, which is
Yeah,
absolute nightmare, even to the most totally dedicated experts. It is a nightmare managing email. And
yeah,
thank you, Google.
yes, yes.
Well,
Well,
you know,
I agree.
And you did a business
it's
out of it. Good for you.
not really.
Okay, what do you think, Peter? I'd like to have your story, your perspective on that.
So
We're
they
talking
pick
about the cloud, and Peter is an expert in the cloud, right? I
Please.
mean,
well,
basically, it is the cloud that allows these devices to
Because
sync.
it totally relates to Larry's theme. What about centralization versus decentralization? So go ahead.
well,
Peter.
so they make these services high quality and free because they want to destroy the ability of any other tech company starting and joining the fight. And okay, again, I'm gonna, with Larry's permission, show a slide here and tie back to the Myspace versus Facebook comment because it.
Please do.
All right, so I wanted to also comment on the concept of scale. So Larry, you thrown in a question that we haven't gotten to yet about what motivates politically, personally, the executive drive or the approach these big companies do. And we were also talking about, we talked earlier, John mentioned what a lot of Silicon Valley companies will say, that it's competitive, we can be replaced, and so forth. And I after having been in that world for a bit, one of the conclusions I came away with was that that's just not true. And the simplest explanation is just to look at the scale, because scale matters. You get this.
Sorry, Peter. You started this subject when I said thank you, Google, for giving the world Gmail, and you said, "Oh, we didn't give it to you for the reasons you think we did."
Oh, was that? Should I restate that? Yeah, it was. Oh, yes, that's true. Yes. So because they're giving fundamental things for free because they've identified what are possible beachheads on which they can be attacked. So they will create free services as defensive barriers, so that there's
against potential new startups.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And they give away for free because it makes it really difficult to compete. And they create.
Yeah, they killed Yahoo Mail and Hotmail with that move. Yeah.
Yes, but more importantly,
and a dozen upstarts probably we never heard of. Yeah.
Well, because they've created this model where to be competitive technologically and with features, you have to already be at scale, because your only monetization that's available to you is advertising.
Yeah. So, and if you can feed that army of engineers to maintain this. Yeah.
Right. And 20 years ago, you didn't need an army, and that's what's different. Right.
Mm-hmm. True.
So when I earlier said name one, company that has overtaken another, I need to contextualize it, but let me show you. I pulled this together while we were chatting here, that what scale means. So this is like the kind of slide that Silicon Valley techs and apologists, I guess, like to say that, oh, we competed at a side. So my first comment was that generally they didn't. What they did was that they overtook them. So if we track Myspace as the first page, and you will see this pattern, the patterns I'm going to show now, you will see everywhere once you start digging. So Myspace was, doing fine, and for quite a while, but it got overtaken. Now let's put this in perspective. The diagram I just showed you is down here. This guy.
All right.
So
then it's just Facebook.
Then it's just Facebook. because so it's yes, technically you're right. The market, it was competitive in the early phase, but so was every new industry. Like every new industry is like this. So when airlines started buying airplanes, I think there were like 20 or 30 companies that were publicly listed on Wall Street that were all making airplanes, and they were all going to change the world, right? And then you end up with like one in
the US, one in Europe.
No. This is very, very important. No, this is very, very important.
Okay.
We got one, and then you had superpower competition creating the second. Very, very different concept. Airbus would not have existed if if Boeing was allowed to compete throughout in Europe. And that was not acceptable to Europe. There would only, and similarly in China, there would be no competition if the Chinese government, Boeing would have controlled everything everywhere, period. It was one. And we see this in industry after industry, and I'll get to TikTok in a second.
Yeah,
it's the same
it's the
thing,
winner-take-all phenomenon that I alluded to, I think, in the very beginning of the conversation.
Yes, but the point is that it's
human life that happens to be accelerated on the internet.
It's locked. It gets locked in. So there is no, the interesting story with Facebook and TikTok and Snapchat is that Snapchat was not able to overtake Facebook or be really competitive with it for reasons that have to do with scale and legal and so forth. And the reason that TikTok is a player now is because the superpower play. So if Facebook had been allowed to compete properly in China, there would be no TikTok. Right? So TikTok is the Airbus phenomenon, right? But domestically, there is no counter to it. And having just a single manufacturer like Boeing for commercial is not such a big deal for the U.S. government, so they don't care. They do care about military aircraft, so they've made sure that there's at least 2, sometimes 3, that are capable of making a military aircraft. So the winner takes all is a industrial phenomenon. But just like you said, John, one of the things that's happened is it's gone faster. But the real biggie here is that this is the winner take all in the context of the slide I showed before. Imagine if when the printing press was invented, there was a winner take all opportunity for some guild to control it. What would the world have looked like? Wouldn't have been good, would be my prediction. So what's unique here is that where the winner take all phenomenon historically, and I'm talking like the entire history of human civilization and trade, of anything remotely like human civilization, in the entire history, we've never had the concept of a winner take all that is present in the fundamentals of human society, right? So there's been some close analogs to it. A key to the British Empire's success was that they hired all the good shipwrights from Holland and so forth, so that they were the only ones that could really make good ships, and they were buying them over. But two can play that game. So when the United States came along, they did the same thing with factories, and they pulled over people who knew how to build factories with huge contracts from England to build them in the United States, which was part of the trade war that then was fed into the Civil War. But what's happening here is we're getting this superpower behavior, that we're getting winner take all, that is corporate governmental union in the US and is government union in China. And the EU is the only holdout that is developing open source alternatives and so forth. But it's only able to at best defend its own environment a little bit. And
the EU wasn't even able to keep the web core development in Europe, and God knows there were so many proposals to do exactly that.
No, but at least Europe has.
You guys were faster.
Fine, but Europe has been able to.
Europe has totally failed with the web, I say.
But the EU has the power to do its own decisions on monopolistic practices. Correct. And it has a power that it demonstrated with GDPR and other efforts to control the data, the nature of the data crossing its borders.
With
GDPR
with a big stick, yeah, with enforcement.
yes, well,
that says,
with a
we're
very
gonna
big
fine you like 10% of your revenue if you don't
Yes.
comply. I've never seen that anywhere else. Right?
no, exactly,
Wow.
exactly, right, and so the EU, so Brussels is onto this, right? But the US is like US citizens are just going into this hole that is going to become some version of what the trend we're on now is we're trending towards some version of what we see in Hong Kong and China. I mean, that's the direction
In the US?
that the US is heading towards with with this union of big political parties and big corporate entities. And the reason for that is that the United States does not have the federal protections that Europe has. Europe ultimately has the European Parliament, and the European Commission, which for important decisions require unanimity. And in the U.S., this has been over 100 years slowly been put out of function. So in the U.S., if you can convince 50.5% of people to go along with what one party thinks, then anything goes increasingly. And the European Union has safeguards that are younger than the American ones, but I think GDPR and other efforts show that they're still effective. So with the internet, the concept of the internet sort of going really bad is a very American thing, to be clear. If you're in Europe, you've got a lot more alternatives and a lot more freedom.
Well, I would dispute that because there's bad stuff also in what Europe is doing to the net in forcing people to behave, companies to behave in a certain way, and
yeah, but that's Morocco versus Zimbabwe. That's Morocco versus Zimbabwe, right? So we're talking about good, and we're talking about bad and worse, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, I get that. But what fascinates me about what's happening in the US in terms of the fundamental rights is that it's the country that has enshrined the right to free speech into some kind of absolute, with a much stronger voice publicly than even the French people did. And the French were the champions, the original champions of free speech are the French philosophers of the Renaissance, right? But the US took that and ran with it and amplified it. Free speech is fundamental, whatever. And today, free speech is stifled in the US a lot more than it is in Europe. And the argument seems to be, well, there's a constitutional protection in the US that the government will not infringe on your free speech, but a corporation, of course, is free to do it. And isn't that a bit weird? And like, if it's a universal truth, why does it apply only to government and not to corporations? I fail to see the point. Yes. Do you need a constitutional amendment for that?
Yes, you raise some interesting questions. The thing is, the United States, well, let's just put it this way. The United States has a different kinds of censorship from Europe. In Europe, the government actually censors people based on their point of view. In the UK, they have actually arrested people for Facebook and Twitter posts and that sort of thing. It's and that would, well, it's never happened in the United States. That wouldn't happen in the United States. On the other hand, you've got
wait, sorry, where has somebody been arrested?
In the UK. Yeah, I mean, like the.
Or I suppose in Germany, where you're not supposed to sell Nazi insignias, but it's very, very, very restricted cases that are boxed in specific kind of speech is prohibited in a specific nation. But
right.
Anyway,
well,
ahead,
I mean,
there's
certain kinds of speech are protected, and certain kinds are not in Europe. So I mean, I think you could well be right. I'm not.
Well, so you're outnumbered here, Europeans. So Americans say Europe. Americans say Europe, and okay, everything west of the Urals. So like the United Kingdom has never been a big home of free speech.
I think they would disagree, and they would have
Well,
disagreed
fine,
until
but you
like a few decades ago. It's like,
sure, but
this
if
is
you get into a room
the rights
members
of
from all the
Englishmen.
other European countries, they would agree with me. So if we set aside the opinion of the British about Britain, then I think you'd say, you know, so freedom of the speech as a strong tradition is a Franco-Germanic Nordic or West Germanic. Is a North Frankish, West Germanic, lower countries Nordic phenomenon. And that is a very specific cultural zone that has boundaries moving across it. So, you know, when Germany was cracking down on free speech leading up to World War II, you know, the US will say Germany, Europeans will say, no, Prussia, right? So it's right. So the boundaries are very different. Right?
Definitely not Bavaria.
So you know, you'll have, it's not a coincidence that the only nation scale publication that dared publish offensive cartoons were Paris and Copenhagen. And that's not a coincidence, right?
And got killed for it.
Yeah, well, yeah, and they got in trouble for it. But you had a solidarity in those cultures. So you had the French press had solidarity with the situation in France, and the Scandinavian press had solidarity with the situation in Copenhagen.
For an American audience, the feeling here is, I hate what you say, but if somebody prevents you from saying it, I hate that more.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and the U.S.
Rousseau,
the U.S. talks a lot about freedom of speech, but you know, the true home of it is in those areas, right? So
I'm not going to argue with you about that. I mean, it's
funny. Peter has a leg on each side.
Well, that's why I figured it out. That's why I spent 20 years there and then 20 years here, and I'm like, yeah, the story I'm being told.
I mean, and the only reason I'm not going to argue with you about it is that it's not quite relevant to what we're discussing.
Okay, so put us back on track, please.
Yeah. So here's the question.
Well, it is, no. I disagree. I disagree. It's profoundly relevant. Because this it's the difference of traditions about whether the local grassroots organizations will push back against big corporations or big government or not. Right. So in France, if there's too much pushback, you will have trucks shutting down Paris. Right. Never happens in the United States ever. Now, you know, that cuts into the competitive abilities of the French economy.
Expect our courts to stand up for free speech. I mean, I really wonder what would happen.
No. It's the general population stands up for it.
Yes, exactly.
Well, look, if the
general population doesn't stand up for it, it won't happen. Truly, it's lost.
I don't know.
The United States never really.
There's a thing that we have never tested in the United States, and that is a situation where the Supreme Court fails to protect real freedom of speech against censorship, against especially political viewpoint censorship.
There's a ton of examples of that.
Where the Supreme Court fails to protect that? Not really. I mean, the Supreme Court has for a very long time been very much free speech absolutist, as the phrase goes. I'm not saying it's perfect.
All right. So when the U.S. Post Office, which was federal, shut down the ability of northern publications to send newsletters by mail during the abolition fighting era, what did the Supreme Court do?
I don't know.
Nothing. Because what the U.S. Supreme Court has as a power, which is very important, is they get to choose what cases to bring up. And that is a political design decision. The typical high courts of the world don't work that way. There's a separate mechanism of deciding what cases. When I, in a tiny case, sued the Swedish government over a Freedom of Information Act issue, then the High Court of Sweden did not have a choice of saying, no, we're not going to take this up.
Well, there's got to be some way of whittling down the number of cases, obviously.
Yes, but if it's done by the court itself, then they can conveniently avoid getting involved in a lot of things.
Yeah,
That's right.
That's interesting.
So then that people can say, oh, the Supreme Court has always upheld freedom of speech. Yeah, whenever they allow in the case.
So
So what
Larry,
did the Supreme
the
Court say
internet that's
about?
broken? It's the US.
And China and
All right.
and other places, right?
Okay,
So,
okay.
so the real question, Jean, is like the vision of distribution. How does it get co-opted into something else? How does that process happen? And what do people need to do to stop it or reverse it, right? I mean, that's ultimately the high level question.
And it starts in kindergarten. How do you educate kids?
Yes.
Right. Well, okay. Let's reorient this a little bit and take up one last question. And I think it's a very interesing question.
We're happy to come back, Larry, and,
Yeah,
and,
sure,
and,
I'm
give you a hard time.
Having fun.
Absolutely. I remember talking to friends around, 1995, 2000, who were certain that the internet could never be censored. I remember having a conversation, even as late as like, let's see, 2001. I remember talking to an old friend of mine from high school who also had gotten into tech. And we were talking about Wikipedia and so forth. And he thought it was really cool. And yeah, we got to talking about like the Internet Archive and all of the wonderful new resources that were coming online. And I wondered, I remember sort of like wondering out loud that, what really is going to happen when, the BPs and the giant corporations. I thought that, it would be corporations like that, the old, Dow industrial type corporations that would somehow dominate. I didn't realize that it would be brand new corporations like Google. But what would happen when those would take it over, and sort of corporatize the internet? Because it wasn't really corporatized yet back then. And he said, well, that would never happen because, look, the internet is built on these open protocols. And so it's easy, if people start shutting down, access to the Internet Archive or whatever, for people to make copies and just start up something new and all the rest of that. And now I worry that the simple difficulty of doing anything on the internet, the expense, among other things, as we were saying, has rendered that attitude naive. And there are other reasons too to think that it was naive. And so the question is, was there a dangerous naivete in our early attitudes between 1990 and 2005 or so, about the prospects of internet freedom?
I think it was more optimism than naivete. I mean, these people were not dumb.
But clearly it was naive, though, right?
No, I agree. I agree.
It was optimism, but then other things happened. And it's the same when Peter says, if the general population doesn't support free speech, then no government can mandate it. Well, on the internet, if the general population doesn't care about their freedoms, which most of them don't, even though they may claim, oh yes, we want freedom and we want stuff, but yeah, the next day nobody cares. And then you'll never get it. So
I mean, I'll take an example.
I wouldn't blame the corporations that much.
Which will offend any blue listener, obviously. It was truly shocking to me when Twitter deplatformed a sitting United States president.
Yeah.
that would never have happened in a West European country. There would have been uproar. That would never have happened in France, right?
Uproar from the people who are against the guy as well. It would have been general uproar.
I mean, could you imagine if Minitel had deplatformed Mitterrand? I mean, there would have been an uproar. It was like, what the hell are you doing? Right? And there was no uproar. And that was really scary. I mean,
and there was a pylon. There was rather a pylon.
Well, the pylon was because
giddy about getting rid of this guy.
Yeah, but that's related to another issue. But that, I think, is an example of where citizenry, exactly what John said, right? Exactly that what John. This philosophy that, okay, I hate what you're saying, but I hate even more if someone shuts you down. And I think that was a perfect example of it. I mean, so Trump was saying a lot of stupid shit. Okay. He's a politician. I'm sorry. Have you been paying attention to politics since, the creating of the republics? Like they say stupid stuff all the time, right? I mean, I remember,
just said it louder and more provocatively than most.
Plus people decided to get offended by it. I mean, I remember when Obama was running the first or the second time when he was trying to get the miners' vote and was advocating clean coal, and I'm like, seriously. You can't possibly believe the economics of clean coal. You're just saying that, and nobody in media called him out on it. Right? Nobody did.
Oh, then Trump says clean coal, and everybody says he's.
Well, yes, exactly. Yeah. But so no matter what, a candidate is one thing, but we're talking about a constitutionally still sitting, not deposed, not judged impeachment president gets deplatformed. Why would that not have created an uproar on Twitter with everybody saying, well, I'm out of here. If you guys do this stuff, I'm not going to use Twitter.
And then 2 months later, there were review boards, as I understand it, within Twitter and within Facebook and within whoever who said, yes, the decision is good and we're going to keep him deplatformed.
Yeah, but it's not a proper review board. Wow. They pick the review board, right?
Yeah,
and I looked at the list of that review board. And of the Facebook review board, and a majority of them are not Americans.
Really? Wow.
Yes. Yes, exactly. I'm like, wow. Could you imagine? I mean, John, could you imagine like France or Germany, where they deplatformed a sitting head of state, and then foreigners get together to vote on whether that was appropriate or not? I mean, could you imagine the French delegating that to Germany, or the Germans delegating that to France? I mean, like. There'd be like, it would never happen. So that was another, there was no uproar that instead, the media said, oh, Facebook has a review board. They're not American.
I'll tell you why.
But their reaction was, oh, anyway, he said stupid shit, so he kind of deserved it. He got it coming. Okay, he got it coming, but he was also a sitting.
No, the reason why that happened.
Freedom of speech. This is so absurd.
Yes, exactly.
So listen, the reason why that is that the people who are running those corporations are leftists, and they have been
I understand the mechanism, Larry. I understand.
And they have been indoctrinated for like a couple of decades now.
That's not the point.
Into multiculturalism.
That's not the point. The point isn't why they did it.
The point is the Americans take that multiculturalism so seriously that it actually.
The point is why were there not strong enough reasons for them not to be able to do it? That is the question.
Right. Look, Larry, I'm old enough to remember when being a leftist meant you stand up for freedom of speech.
Sure. Me too.
Even freedom of speech of the fascists. That was a left ideology when I was a kid.
Sure.
Yeah, it backfired a little bit in some cases, but yes. Yeah. So the other thing I wanted to throw in there, and then I'll let John and Larry talk, is that scale is also very relevant, right? So what I've discovered with the thing that's why I think it was more optimism, naivety. There was an element that wasn't understood 10, 15, 20 years ago, which was we always thought of censorship as Europeans seeing the internet come about. We always thought of censorship as being a black or white thing. If a book is forbidden, then it's forbidden. And they're all destroyed, and people, Mujahideen will go to bookstore and destroy it. And what's happened in the
church did that a lot, yeah.
Yes, and they searched out every single copy, right?
Correct.
So, for example, there's only one official version of the Quran right now because in the 10th century, the caliphate decided to go and look at every variation of it and destroy it and pretend there'd only ever been one version. Now I just offended another billion people on this channel, but they can go and ask, they can go and look it up, ask their Google
We can
ML, and they'll say
deplatform
yes.
as well.
Yes, yeah, we can platform, you can't show this anywhere. But what I've discovered is that this new corporate semi-fascist system developed in the United States has realized that it's a much better to just make it hard for you to find as opposed to completely censoring it.
Right.
And that is the essence, because the arguments are out there, you know, you can
It's
put
a shadow
them up.
banning, yeah, yeah.
Yes, and I have examples of like controversial things where Google will put the search result on page 5 and DuckDuckGo will put it 3rd, right? But since no one uses DuckDuckGo, they won't find it.
And that ties into what I said about all human communication in public forums being mediated by AI today.
Yes, and people allow AI to be doing it, right? So if I
and
say
AI is not very subtle, you know, about
No.
whose opinions are worth being propagated.
I mean, I would another
Not
sort of,
very subtle at all.
Yeah.
well, I said I was going to say that.
Hey,
and
it's
then be
mainstream,
quiet,
it's
so
an
I'll-
opinion, that's it.
Exactly.
The rest gets out.
And then
You
it
know,
just
AI is very
and then
good at spotting
and
things
then it
keep them in
drowns
boxes.
everything out. Right? So it drowns everything out. So I can't on Twitter look at an opinion and see what is a good counter opinion, because they just use the likes and the bots and it's drowned. There's 100 people, you know, downvoting you, and God knows if they're a human being.
Even if you want to get out of your information bubble, you can't. You can't see anything.
No, because there's no one there, and so it's about friction. So the United States system that's happening now is just, let's create a lot of friction and a lot of subtle threats, but it's not actually executing anybody for saying something unaccepted. We're not going to burn them at the stake. What we are going to do is just make sure that your career starts going sideways and your neighbors don't start liking you, and no one can find your opinions anymore because they for some reason don't pop up on the search engine. That 90. Well, yes, but it's more clever, right? It's just
memory hole
harder. I'm not going to say which
term
book.
Unperson. You become an unperson.
Yes, and when I've been researching various things, I sometimes come across like a book that's remarkably hard to find. Just doesn't get reissued, doesn't get reprinted. I just got one delivered a few days ago that I discovered there were 2 existing copies in the world, and I had to buy it in Europe. It's an American book for $85 and have it shipped over because it never got reprinted and it's not available in the US. It's funny how that works.
Not
right?
digitized even.
So it's about friction. So the naivety was I mean, you can't call it naive if it was a fundamentally new phenomenon. And the fundamentally new phenomenon is the combination of the fact create a lot of friction and have a populace, an American populace, that unfortunately does not fight for itself.
Well, you know, let me defend this thesis that we were naive around 2000 about the prospects of freedom on the internet, and the reason was that we made a kind of what I describe as like a social contract. It was never official in any way, except insofar as we were clicking on user agreements, but basically, when we started using YouTube to upload our videos instead of putting them on our own websites, or when we started, you know, like using Facebook instead of all of its various competitors, we were giving them essentially all sorts of access to our personal data, and there was an implicit ability to control our activity on their websites, obviously, but we never would have gotten involved. We never would have like given them the authority that we did. At least a lot of us wouldn't have, if we knew how it was going to look in 2020. If we were able to see just 10 years in advance, especially.
Are you saying it's like the slowly boiling frog analogy?
Well, yes. I mean, I think that's perfectly perfectly legitimate. I actually think it was quite gradual. and so we did have to choose to trust certain kinds of people, and namely the executives of internet startups. I mean, there was a time between 2000 and 2005 when companies.
I do want to comment on that specifically. But
okay, but companies like Facebook and YouTube were like really hot, fresh, new things. They were the underdogs, and they were run by geeks, right? And geeks, everybody can trust geeks. I mean, for 10 years or more, we had been trusting geeks with our logins. We had been trusting geeks with all kinds of personal information on their servers, and we never had any reason to worry about the safety of our information in their hands. And okay, so some of those geeks actually started becoming millionaires and then billionaires based on their the money that well, based on the stuff that they made. And so I actually think there was a period between 2000 2010 or so, 2012, right around the time when people were still hyping the internet and only just very slowly becoming more critical of Silicon Valley startups. There was a time when the Silicon Valley startup scene was idolized. It was like it was like treated as something. Yeah, they were like rock stars, and that was naive. That is the thing that was naive. And when we did that, over the objections of a lot of the Richard Stallman types. Not that I like Richard Stallman anymore, but all kinds of social, open source advocates, right? Mm-hmm. People like Peter is now. So Peter actually has a privacy oriented foundation. Now, back then, there were people who advocated a lot all the time for open source. And so there was the guy who, Eric Raymond was one of them, for example. Richard Stallman was another, and Larry Lessig and so forth. Those guys,
John Perry Barlow, yeah, whatever.
They came out in favor.
So I think we're going to have to continue after the break, right? Because we have.
I think Peter, you have a lot of things to say. So
I do, but
I'll give you the post-break start, and I'll just remark on one thing that Larry just said. Larry, you said repeatedly, why did we give these people the ability and the authority to basically take over our lives and the way the digital world operates? Yes. Who's we?
Well, I mean, each individual user of their systems.
No. Well, yes, each individual user, but who are these users? The early users, and in that, don't put only the pioneers, only the geeks. The early user, let's say the first 100 million users of the internet, which is basically the state of the internet in 2000. It's 100 million people. Mm-hmm. Forget these people, because then there came 1 billion people and 2 billion and now 4.5 billion. Yeah. And these guys had no idea what it meant to be decentralized, and so they just used whatever was most convenient, and we cannot blame these people. So when you say we gave them the authority, well, if we is a clique of the pioneers and the guys who were in the know, they should have built competing systems. Some did, some tried and failed. Mm-hmm. And if we is the rest of the world, all the citizens of the world, I don't blame them.
Yeah. Well, so, I hope that the rest of us anyway have learned our lesson, and that we are no longer trusting people like Mark Zuckerberg and the rest.
Your first thesis that the engineering part was naive, was shot down by John pointing out it was optimistic, and your restated thesis is I'm just rewriting history here. It's the internet, isn't that how it works? And your second thesis your restating of it was that, okay, we had trust in these geeks and executives. So let's untangle that, right? So nobody ever trusted Mark Zuckerberg, ever. Let's start with that, all right? You pick a college friend of his who says this is an ethical, trustworthy guy. You won't find it. He's never been that kind of guy. He was never like an inside geek. He was never in the open source community. He was an outsider who realized he can make a lot of power and money here. So
Well,
Facebook is in this category.
We're splitting hairs then.
No. Let me get to it. Let me
Okay.
hold on. I haven't made the main point.
Make your
It's like
point.
there's two categories, right? Because you're saying, wait, we put your trust in the geeks. Nobody ever put their trust in the so-called geek Zuckerberg. So let's look at some of the other people. Larry Sergey, Evan, Jack.
You should give the last names because the audience is not necessarily familiar with.
Oh,
everybody
okay,
who's
Jack Dorsey, Larry Sergey, co-founders of Google, Evan Spiegel, co-founder of Snap. And we could also add, the name escapes me, co-founder of Yahoo, who
Jerry Yang.
Yes, Jerry, who lost control of his board because it was in a generation of companies where he didn't have controlling stake in stock. So if we look at those guys, right, what's happened is the death by 1,000 cuts. So it's one thing. So when the founder makes 10 million, 100 million, a billion, then the founder is getting growing independence. But the next two layers are of a different breed. And to stay competitive, you need the money for them. And they are a whole other breed, right? So if you look at the first generation of executives of Google, they're all gone. None of them are in major operational roles.
Why is that?
Well, because you get this, there's a couple of factors. You get a pull and a push. You got this constant pressure to make more money and make more money. And you still have to retain your talent, and you have to give them, if you don't share the spoils, it's like any corrupt system. If you're not sharing the spoils,
Oh, I see. Okay.
right? Then
So you kind of have to create an oligarchy.
Yes.
Otherwise, it falls apart.
Yes.
Oh gosh.
And that is the mechanism. I've seen it firsthand in two companies I've worked at, and other companies that I've had insight into.
How are they sharing the spoils exactly? What do you mean by that?
So
the difference that's changed. One of the things there's so much money to make, right? So it used to be amazing if a founder would make $100 million a year. At these big companies, the whole first and sometimes second level of executives are all making $100 million a year. Right? And if they can't make it there, they'll go out and compete somewhere else where they can make $1 billion a year, right? So people get hired with $100 billion packages, $1 billion packages. And so it is those levels, right? So we have to go back in political history to see parallels here. You have to go and look at leadership structures like Julius Caesar to understand how these things happen, right? Because you get the spoils of war, and if you're not sharing it with your generals,
it's the
then
dukes and the barons and the
exactly, and it's the same, and you can't resist it. And I've seen these people resist it, push back until they just give up and sort of retreat.
Interesting.
So they were naive in thinking that they could do this, but it's unfair to blame. When we're blaming individuals, we need to distinguish between the individuals that are sociopaths from the beginning and the individuals that eventually had to accept that their company was being run by a new generation of sociopaths. I mean, that's essentially the trade-off, right? So it is the driver amount of money. And the money is insane. And this is like a thing that people do not understand, right? So this year, we're talking about trillions of dollars going out across these the top 2, 3, 4, 5 tiers of these companies. It's the biggest plunder of resources as a percentage since Genghis Khan, right? So, and you know, Genghis had the same mechanism. He gave entire provinces to, so family, but so they are in an environment that they can't resist it, right? So they can't.
A few who resist, they just walk out because, hey, I've got 50 million, I've got enough, I'll do something else.
They kind of walk out. So they retreat to be like a chairman of the board instead of being the CEO, or they remain the CEO, but they delegate a lot of power to their executives. Or in the case of Steve Jobs, they pass away. And it's now the meritocracy generals with no particular strong ethical systems that are in charge. So that's what happened with all these systems, right? So it's the founders having, for the big notable exception is Mark Zuckerberg, who no one ever says is like this. He was in it for the money and the power from the beginning. But all these other players, right, were not, and we're fighting for these values. But the difference in amount of money. So I can give you some data on this because I was in the inside. I had access to the data.
Inside.
And the difference in like revenue per US user of, let's say, a mobile app that everyone's using, between just a little bit of advertising and completely intrusive advertising is going from like $30 to $300, right? And so we're talking about an order of magnitude more money, and now it's even going even higher. So if you look at the SEC filings of these companies, they go into other industries in order to not make it obvious how much they're screwing over people. One of the reasons Facebook spent $16 billion on WhatsApp was to water out the number of users, and they stopped reporting their revenue per US mobile users in their filings. And they just got themselves another 600 million users so that the numerator denominator would wash it out. So you didn't realize how much money they were making on it. Google in its early days tried to delay public filing as a company. They began trying to split the company in two because the SEC had rules that you can't have more than a certain number of shareholders before going public. And they were entertaining rules of splitting the company in two to split the shareholders in two to delay it because they didn't want Yahoo and others to see how much money they were making. So it's like it's like a cartel, right? It's like if you go back and look at some of the Hollywood movies.
Much bigger than Rockefeller ever was.
Much bigger, right? So it becomes an organism unto itself. So if we look specifically at certain decisions, for example, the one I mentioned that Trump got deplatformed, it's not clear that Jack Dorsey ever approved that. It looks like it happened when he was out of office, when he was not at the office.
Interesting.
And then he was faced with a fait accompli when he got back.
So this oligarchy, as you say, that must develop itself, or otherwise
it becomes a cancer. Yes, because exactly.
So it's like the Chinese Communist Party. Then what's the difference?
Yes. Which is why they have so many similarities. It becomes a systemic thing.
They're engineers, the rulers of China. They're mostly engineers. They're famed for that. They have to manage a country with billion for people, and
if they don't deliver riches for their, because their clique,
or the mentor,
exactly, then they get overthrown. There's no check. There's no check and balance on the side, and then you just get runaway capitalism, which we've seen before. And now it's a combination of runaway centralization. Sorry,
I don't think of this as a capitalism at all. I mean, I would think of it as runaway corporatism,
capitalism that Karl Marx complained about.
Oh, I suppose.
Well, so Karl Marx theory applies.
I'm against it too. Geez, and I'm not a Marxist. I guarantee that.
Well, Karl Marx had, the thing to remember is that a lot of what Karl Marx wrote, he had a point. And it's the Leninist movement that we today associate with, extreme Bolshevism and so forth. So the analysis applies in the sense that it is what is the production of value, right? And it used to be the thing that happened that Marx was objecting to was that the production of value wasn't a factory worker, but it was controlled by the owner of the capital. If you didn't own the factory, you didn't own the machines. So there was a limit to how much a big farmer could control, because your people could just go off and start a small farm somewhere else, right? Or emigrate to the United States or Argentina or whatever, right? But with capitalism, if you needed the factory, the steam engine, then the individual worker was replaceable and had no bargaining power. And the revolutions happened to give people, like people forget, 150 years ago in the United States, it was illegal to quit your job. It was literally illegal to quit your job. One of the things driving political reforms in the 1920s in Germany was that you should be allowed to quit your job without starving, because what happened is that you quit your job, you got blacklisted, nobody would hire you, and then you starve. And that was happening, right? What we have now is we've got a different means of production, which is the individual digital citizen,
the attention,
eyeball,
attention economy. Yeah.
Yes,
And
and
used to be labor. Now it's eyeballs. Yeah.
yes. And as soon as you realize that, you realize, oh, all of Karl Marx's analysis apply here too. If you allow arbitrary control of that, so they're saying, well, you clicked the user license agreements, you must be okay with it. Yeah, that was the same case in the 1800s. If you signed the labor agreement, then you were committed. Except the labor agreement also, your employment contract also said you have to buy the food from your company. You have to rent your apartment from the company. You're not allowed to quit. That would be in the contract. And until labor law came along and said that that's not enforceable, that was just a voluntary agreement. And they were hearing the same shit now about these user license agreements. Oh, it's all voluntary. It's all convenient. Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, all right. And then what? What happens at
you're
scale?
free not to agree with our user license, and in that case, you're free to leave the service.
Well,
Yeah,
and in the United States now, we're hearing people saying that,
that's-
well, if you don't like it, you're free to leave the country.
Yeah, you're free to leave. Yeah.
Yes, and go where?
Hey, you don't like censorship on Twitter? You're free to leave Twitter.
Yeah,
Oh,
exactly.
by the way, every competitor to Twitter gets banned as well. Hey, who cares?
Or acquired.
That's right. Well, you know what? There was a time though when that that wouldn't have flown, and you know, all we were busy giving away our rights, indeed, in EULAs, and we didn't realize or anticipate what the outcome was going to be. And I mean, your analysis is fascinating, absolutely fascinating.
What
to
Peter
me,
just
because
described
things
is so ruthless.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean I know what to do about it, right? Like
Right,
we talked
right.
about like before.
Yeah.
Yes, I
just
still think
diagnose
that
it.
doesn't
cure.
Like, oh, you've got stage 3 lung cancer. Okay, thank you. Now what?
It was still naive because we still didn't realize what was going to happen, and some people did. Some people were in a position they were more clued into history and into and so forth.
So that's interesting. Who did? Who would you say did see it?
Those people that I mentioned before, the people who didn't want to use browsers that supported JavaScript, things like that. People who were acting on principle because they knew they're like giving away so much authority to the people who are controlling the code that was running on their computers.
But
I don't know if they were sophisticated in terms of like the historical.
But I would still argue that they were optimistic, not naive, because they didn't realize they were against it, but they did not realize how bad it would get.
Come on, you're optimistic
Maybe.
about Wikipedia, and now you think Wikipedia is biased. But
Well,
you
wait,
love Wikipedia.
what? Wikipedia's
What did
biased?
you mean? What?
Yeah.
News?
What?
Is that news?
No, I was very naive about a lot of things. I admit that, and I was sure.
A power click developed within Wikipedia, like Peter.
Well, it was something that I feared. That was something
An
that I feared.
anonymous one.
Actually,
We have no idea who they are or who's paying their wages.
that's right. No, that's right. We can establish that there is that there are power clicks. There must be, in
Yeah,
fact.
but it's human history. It's human nature. It's society. People.
So,
develop into cliques, and the most successful cliques become, let's say, religions or states or feudal things or corporations.
I mean,
so
if you have two continents and all the trade goes across one narrow part of the river, somebody is going to build a bridge and a fort and take it from there. And you know, and if the rest of the world isn't defending the communal values, the communal assets, but we're creating this communal value, which, you know, was part of Marxist analysis. Like we've got this communal value, so why does it all end up in the pocket of this tiny number who just happened to control the means of production? Was the word I was looking for, like the means of production.
I think the whole idea of a commons preceded Marx for sure.
Yes.
But he was applying it to the Industrial Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
So who cares?
Because the difference is that the dilemma with the commons doesn't have a sort of black hole effect. You can always go to another village with another commons. Right. So what he was calling out was that it's got this runaway effect of becoming like not just the local villages commons, but the whole sort of nation's commons. And even then it was new in the sense that even the commons was just a part of your economic production. Right. So if you were a member of that village, you still had your small little farm. So the commons was still just a component. And what Mark was pointing out was that this is the life for people. This is their only source of income. So if you live in Scotland, there were like, 20 rich people who controlled all the factories. And if you didn't work for one of them, you had no other choices because the countryside was overpopulated, right? So it was fundamentally different than the common thing.
Well, I'd like to come back to the internet. I mean, it's fascinating, this lesson of history. And
in fact, I think we need to wrap things up.
If we come back to the internet, Larry, why do we notice so much that things have gone seemingly out of control, right? And despite the best intentions of a lot of people involved, it's because, and we said it repeatedly, the internet, like the printing press, has accelerated a lot of these processes. So a clique that would form over 2 or 3 generations, the merchant guilds, whatever, creating the bourgeoisie and then the proletariat coming, took decades. And the internet, you can have a corporation created in 2005, 15 years later is the biggest thing in the world. That's super accelerated time frame, and this clique necessarily forms inside that corporation. And I don't think any level of technological solution or architectural solution is going to,
because it's not a technical problem.
Human
right?
nature.
I mean,
it's human nature.
Yeah.
I think, Larry, sorry, you are naive if you think you can fix knowledge distribution by making standards to share encyclopedias. Sure, that will be a useful thing to do. I totally agree with the idea, but it's not going to fix the development of cliques controlling information.
I don't know. I think there's a lot of, we may not like somehow simply destroy the existence of power cliques and corporations, but we might reduce their user base.
Wikipedia has reached escape velocity. It's what Peter showed, like Facebook did. Once you reach escape velocity, there's no way you come back into orbit.
But look, it's easy to see.
My opinion.
I don't know. I know, but I'm arguing against it. It's easy to see.
I don't want to depress Larry by saying that I agree. So that's
it's easy to see.
How on Wikipedia we would be labeled a tag team already. We would be banned already.
Larry, you can have a whole series of us two giving you a hard time.
No, look, I want to say this. I do believe that it is possible, and there's nothing that we have said in all of this that has made it somehow impossible that we can construct a decentralized network of encyclopedias, that we cannot make apps that will tap into that network, that will make them just as easy to find, and so you can find the long tail and an increasingly long tail of really good articles written by all kinds of
Yeah,
people. It doesn't matter
I
where
agree.
they are. And
Can be done.
that ends up being actually more useful than Wikipedia. I think.
You want to know what will happen
And
after
then what
that?
happens to the clique that's running Wikipedia? Well, they become disempowered by the fact that that network is available. Right?
Let me
So
tell
why
you
do
what
you why
happens
do you
after
why
that.
do you why do you think Wikipedia
Oh,
won?
go ahead, Peter. Then I got a story.
Okay. Why do you think
Go ahead.
Wikipedia won, Larry?
Why do I think Wikipedia won?
Yeah.
Well, simply because it was the only source of a kind of information that people wanted. That was easy to find. So if they were looking up an article about
Larry's not
a
looking at us.
butterfly, well,
So what did
one
I say
could-
about Gmail?
I don't know. What did you say about Gmail?
Google gave it away for free, so no one else can make money on it.
Right.
Wikipedia happened as a big phenomenon because Google gave it away because they didn't want anybody else to make money on producing information on the internet.
Well, I mean, I totally agree that Google helped a lot.
No, it was Google, period. Google decided that the Wikipedia search results are going to be at the top because it's not commercial. There were, so they destroyed Encyclopedia Britannica. They destroyed Microsoft's effort at creating.
They didn't destroy
Britannica. Effectively,
Britannica has very minuscule profits compared to like the Silicon Valley giants, and compared to what Wikipedia would be if it were for profit. But they actually have done quite well as an encyclopedia.
No.
Yes, they have. That's a fact. I've talked to the president in the last few years. They're still kicking and they're doing quite well.
What's their profits?
At their level.
Audience. In a very niche
we looked it up.
Relatively well.
2 days ago. It's their profit was, it's laughable. It's like $90 million.
Right.
But
they went on the block $60 million. They were sold several years ago for $60 million. That was their considered value. The fact that they're even existing is because Google tolerates them and now sends traffic to them. So Wikipedia happened because Google was decided to classify it non-corporate.
They don't get their business from Google.
You're missing the point. You're missing the point.
Wikipedia once offered to host Wikipedia. Google once offered to host Wikipedia. Wikipedia refused, but Google still promoted Wikipedia even though they refused.
Yeah, because it created the free alternative, and God knows the relationship between the cliques and Google, so that there is nobody else really who can keep up with the long tail of information. What Encyclopedia Britannica cannot do, because Google stopped them from being able to do it, is to handle the long tail.
Yeah. Well, no. Okay.
And
are you contradicting me? I don't see that you're contradicting anything.
No, not at all.
It's relevant to if you're trying to do something new and different that people will use, because it won't happen because Google won't send the traffic your way and people won't find it.
Oh, well, I don't know about that. I guess we'll find out, won't we? There's also other ways of finding the information. Apps, for example. I guess you'd also have to
I'll go your way. Assume that everything you are setting out to do works and works really well. That means you get this distributed network of encyclopedias and people publishing stuff here and there, and you get a super long tail of stuff. Like millions of sites contributing along some standard.
Sure.
Let's assume that's done. Okay, that might take 8 years, but it's done. You know what happens next?
Exactly. Well, I can predict what you think is going to happen next. Okay, go ahead.
Well, let me say it, then you'll tell me if that's what you thought I would say. What happens next is exactly what happened to the millions of mom and pop shops who were competing with Amazon. Amazon incorporated them into their logistics system, and now they cannot exist without Amazon. That's
Yes.
exactly what will happen to a distributed encyclopedia.
Yes.
Well, I can easily see how Google, for example, as soon as it becomes a threat, would incorporate the.
Yeah, or it will be somebody unknown. You know, one of the zillions of people who will develop tools for your project will do a clever system and become the Amazon of information, of encyclopedias. It may not be Wikipedia, it probably won't be.
Yeah,
Some new guy.
That one reason why we are.
But it will get centralized and it will get a click, I bet you. See you in years.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. I hope not. What I want to do is in the next few months actually is talk about the possibility of what we're trying to do, and defend it against these sorts of objections, because I don't
You have to have a socio-political angle. This is not a technical problem. There must be a socio-political angle to what you're doing.
There must be a mission. Well, Wikipedia has one, you know, the 5 pillars is a political angle.
Well, I think what Peter is saying is there has to be some management and principles that are resistant against takeover, essentially.
But you'll have tension between your ethical system and the willingness to embrace whoever wants to publish anything in whatever way they choose. You'll have tension between those. I have no idea how you're going to resolve that, or how collectively the people trying to support this project will resolve that.
No, I mean, just because you have a social political angle doesn't mean that it's going to work. I'm just saying that if you don't have a strong social political angle, it's not going to work, because the systems, the problem we're in now is because of the, you know, more or less pure technical approach, thinking if we give freedom to everybody, then beauty will follow, without all the other, without any other social political.
Oh, for sure.
Well, 2 hours of conversation, we've gone through 10 examples of this naive thought. Okay.
Yes.
I plead guilty. I was naive of that as well.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I went and worked for the man and sold my soul for 20 years before I started waking up. So I'm certainly not going to throw rocks in greenhouses about being an ethical visionary. I didn't see it getting this bad.
But it was just
it at all.
Inevitable.
Well, I don't know if it's inevitable. I don't want to think that it's inevitable. That's like saying tyranny is inevitable. Periods of it probably are. But I think that ultimately, if the people are educated into the value of liberty, they can resist.
Right.
I mean,
so you're a true traditional left-wing thinker. Congratulations.
The old generation, yeah.
I think of this as a classical
You believe
liberal
in human dignity and progress.
I think all three of us are classical liberals. So.
Yes, perhaps.
Probably.
Think about why the blogosphere does not have a Mark Zuckerberg, perhaps, or a Jack Dorsey. There have been lots of attempts, right? Medium, sure, but Medium is Medium is a drop in the bucket compared to all of the websites that
WordPress.
Well, Blogger.
They just give tools. They don't control content. I'll give you that. But if there's some indexing of blogs, I don't know. I'm not into blogs, but if there's
they don't
some big index of blogs, is there something like that?
They don't control the monetization, guys. Follow the money. They don't control every single blog you go to. Enable the tracker systems in your browser, and you'll see that there's probably Google AdWords on every single one of them.
Yeah, and Facebook.
So they don't control the monetization.
Controlled by Google, right? That just means that Google is dominating the ad system. We already knew that.
They do.
That's
so
fine.
they can demonetize like that. What do you mean that doesn't mean controlled by Google? It's been it's only been more obvious on things like YouTube, But in the general blogosphere, it's happening all the time. You just can't point
go make
to
a
it.
blog about
Massive
climate
numbers
science,
of
and you'll see what
blogs are not
happens to you.
monetized at all, right? My blog has never been monetized by
But you'll
anything
get
like
no
that.
audience. It's the same. Eyeballs are the new money. It's the new currency.
But they're not.
Attention is
They're
currency.
living money
You'll be
that are not
invisible.
controlled by Google in my case.
The
Right?
memory hold and unpersoned.
Well,
Oh,
we'll see
sorry,
about
it's
that.
midnight. I'm starting to be a bit more pessimistic than I was 2 hours ago when I
Yeah.
started saying I'm the
I
optimistic
see
guy in
that.
the
I
room.
see that. Yeah.
My true colors are
So,
showing.
yes. Okay. So, guys,
still
I
in a
think
good mood.
we do need to wrap it up. This has been extremely enjoyable to me, and it's gone on a lot longer than I thought it was going to. And you guys have given us all a great deal to talk about and to think about. Next week, and so for the people who are watching this this week, there is going to be a discussion taking place at encyclosphere.org in an old-fashioned forum, not controlled by Google. And you'll see there. It's going to be a lot of fun, I think. I'll post some questions. In fact, by the time you see this, you will already have gotten some questions. Probably not the ones that I shared with you guys that we've talked about, but some slight variants on those. And I also want to encourage you guys, if you want to like come up with some sort of readings to supplement the last chapter of my book, which is like, it's called the Future of the Free Internet is what it's called. And it really does cover a lot of the topics that we have discussed here. But if you want to like throw a not too long reading of your own into the mix for people to consider.
Okay. I'll give you one right now because I was thinking about it when you were kind of wrapping it up.
Okay.
Peter Thiel, Competition is for Losers.
Okay.
Go read that.
All right. I don't really want to read something by a guy who like drinks blood for rejuvenation.
Whatever. Go read Competition is for Losers. I don't remember if it's an article.
Wait, are you against Orthodox Catholics there, Larry?
Well, that's not the same. Anyway, okay, but okay, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be too dismissive. Jean, please, can you like write that down? I'll make sure that it's included in the email that accompanies this video. And Peter, if you can think of anything, please go ahead.
It'll be a list of 20 books. So
yeah, me too.
Okay, well, just give
whoever edits this video will have
item.
to links to definitions of a lot of inside jargon that we've used, and that'll be fun. So
surveillance,
that would be great.
Surveillance capitalism.
Sure.
You're going to read one book, and that's the one.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, that's a good one.
All right, well, very good. I think we're going to have to call it quits for now, and I hope you guys will show up at the forums next week and respond to some people. And I have little doubt that there's going to be some interesting discussions. So I'm looking forward to it.
Is it in chat form or is it going to be video?
It's a good old-fashioned web forum. In other words, yeah. Long form chat, I guess. So, all right. So again, thank you very much.
Big pleasure. Thanks a lot for inviting us and getting the ball rolling and taking it gracefully when we, go a bit into controversial ideas on which we happen to disagree, but there's a lot of stuff we happen to agree on. So,
and John, real pleasure.
That's how I like it.
Real pleasure to finally meet you. I was studying your work 25 years ago. So yeah, this is a lot of fun, guys.
Yes.
Yeah, we're not getting young.
All right. So long.